The morning sun cast long shadows across Elmwood Air Force Base as Captain Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his helmet and ran through his final pre-flight checks. The F-16 Fighting Falcon hummed beneath him, its engine warming up with the familiar vibration that had become as natural as his own heartbeat over the past 12 years of service. Today's mission was supposed to be routine, a training exercise over the Nevada desert, practicing intercept maneuvers with his wingman, Lieutenant Jake Morrison. Marcus had been flying combat missions since he was 22, fresh out of the Air Force Academy with dreams of defending his country from 30,000 feet. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, logged over 3,000 flight hours, and earned the respect of every pilot on the base. His record was spotless, his reputation unshakable. But today, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the weather conditions or the complexity of their training scenario. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through his headset as they taxied toward the runway. "Red Leader, this is Red 2. All systems green and ready for takeoff." Jake was younger, maybe 26, with the kind of eager enthusiasm that Marcus remembered having once upon a time. He'd been assigned to Marcus's wing 6 months ago, and despite the age difference, they'd developed a solid working relationship built on mutual respect and shared dedication to their craft. The control tower cleared them for takeoff, and Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as his aircraft accelerated down the runway. The desert landscape fell away beneath them as they climbed to their assigned altitude of 15,000 feet. The Nevada wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast expanse of brown and orange terrain broken only by the occasional mountain range or dry river bed. Their mission briefing had been straightforward: simulate an intercept scenario where they would track and engage a mock enemy aircraft played by another pilot from their squadron. It was the kind of exercise they'd done hundreds of times before, designed to keep their skills sharp and their reflexes quick. The enemy would be flying an older F-15 Eagle, giving them a challenging but manageable target to practice their tactics against. As they reached their patrol altitude, Marcus scanned the horizon through his canopy, his eyes moving in the systematic pattern he'd been trained to follow. The desert below looked peaceful, almost serene from this height, but he knew that appearances could be deceiving. In real combat, threats could emerge from anywhere, and the difference between life and death often came down to split-second decisions and the ability to trust your training even when your mind was screaming at you to do something else. Jake's voice came through the radio again, breaking into his thoughts. "Red Leader, I've got something on radar. Bearing 270, approximately 20 miles out and closing fast. Looks like our target has arrived early." Marcus checked his own instruments and confirmed the contact. The exercise was about to begin, and despite having done this countless times before, he felt his pulse quicken with anticipation. The radio crackled with the voice of their exercise controller back at base. Red flight, this is control. Your target is now active and considered hostile. You are cleared to engage with simulated weapons. Remember, this is a training exercise, but treat it as real. Good hunting. Marcus acknowledged the transmission and began banking his aircraft toward the approaching contact, Jake following in perfect formation beside him. As they closed the distance, Marcus's radar began painting a clearer picture of their target. The F-15 was flying at roughly the same altitude, maintaining a steady course that would bring them into visual range within the next few minutes. This was the moment when years of training and experience would take over, when instinct and muscle memory would guide their actions faster than conscious thought could process the information coming through their instruments. The desert sun glinted off something metallic in the distance, and Marcus caught his first visual glimpse of their target. The F-15 was flying straight and level, either unaware of their presence or confident enough to let them make the first move. In a real combat situation, this kind of behavior would be suspicious, but in a training exercise, it was perfectly normal for the enemy to play their role according to the predetermined scenario. Marcus armed his simulated weapon systems and began the complex dance of aerial combat. He would need to position his aircraft for the best possible shot while avoiding giving his opponent the same opportunity. It was a three-dimensional chess match played at hundreds of miles per hour, where every decision carried consequences and every mistake could be fatal. Jake maintained his position off Marcus's right wing, ready to follow his lead or take independent action if the situation called for it. The two pilots had practiced this scenario so many times that they barely needed to communicate verbally. Each knew instinctively what the other was thinking and planning. It was the kind of seamless coordination that came only from hours of training together and complete trust in each other's abilities. The F-15 began to turn, apparently having detected their approach. Marcus watched as the aircraft started a climbing turn to the right, a classic defensive maneuver designed to deny them an easy shot while positioning for a counterattack. He adjusted his own flight path accordingly, beginning the complex calculations that would determine the best angle of attack. The engagement was about to begin in earnest. Marcus's finger hovered over the simulated weapons release button as his targeting system locked onto the F-15. The familiar tone in his headset indicated that his missiles had acquired their target and were ready to fire. In a real combat situation, this would be the moment of truth, when months or years of preparation would culminate in a few seconds of decisive action. Even though this was just an exercise, the adrenaline was real, the focus absolute. The F-15 continued its evasive maneuvers, diving toward the desert floor in an attempt to break the radar lock. Marcus followed, his aircraft screaming through the thin air as he maintained his pursuit. The ground rushed up to meet them, the details of the desert landscape becoming clearer with each passing second. At this altitude, there was little margin for error, and both pilots had to balance the demands of the exercise with the very real need to avoid controlled flight into terrain. As they descended through 8,000 feet, Marcus noticed something that made him pause. There, off to his left, was a formation of rocks that looked strangely familiar. The way they were arranged, the particular shade of the sandstone, the small canyon that cut between them. He'd seen this place before, though he couldn't immediately remember when or under what circumstances. The recognition was like a half-remembered dream, nagging at the edge of his consciousness. The F-15 leveled off at 5,000 feet and began a series of aggressive turns, trying to reverse the situation and get behind Marcus and Jake. It was a skilled maneuver, executed with the precision that came from years of experience, but Marcus was ready for it. He pulled his aircraft into a climbing turn that would keep him out of his opponent's weapons envelope while maintaining his own tactical advantage. Jake's voice came through the radio, calm and professional despite the intensity of the mock combat. "Red leader, I'm moving to flank position. If he tries to extend, I'll be ready to cut him off." Marcus acknowledged the transmission and continued his pursuit, his eyes constantly moving between his instruments and the visual picture outside his canopy. The desert landscape below was a blur of color and shadow, but something about it continued to nag at him. The F-15 suddenly broke left and dove toward a small valley between two ridgelines. Marcus followed, his aircraft's engines screaming as he pushed the throttles forward to maintain contact. The valley was narrow, barely wide enough for two aircraft to maneuver safely, but it provided excellent cover from radar and made targeting extremely difficult. It was exactly the kind of terrain that combat pilots learned to use to their advantage. As they flew deeper into the valley, Marcus felt a strange sense of déjà vu washing over him. The rock formations, the way the light fell across the canyon walls, the particular arrangement of scrub brush and scattered boulders, all of it seemed familiar in a way that made his hands tremble slightly on the controls. He'd been here before, he was certain of it, but the memory remained frustratingly elusive. The F-15 ahead of him suddenly pulled up and out of the valley, forcing Marcus to make a quick decision. He could follow and risk losing his tactical advantage, or he could try to anticipate his opponent's next move and position himself accordingly. Years of training took over, and he chose the latter option, banking his aircraft hard to the right and climbing to intercept the F-15 at a higher altitude. Jake had maintained his position above the valley, and as the F-15 emerged from the canyon, he was perfectly positioned to engage. "Red leader, I have tone. Request permission to engage." Marcus was about to give his approval when something caught his eye that made his blood run cold. There, nestled against the base of a large rock formation, was the unmistakable glint of twisted metal reflecting the desert sun. The wreckage was old, weathered by years of exposure to the elements, but Marcus recognized it immediately. It was the remains of an aircraft, and from the size and configuration of the debris, it looked like it had once been an F-16 just like his own. But it was more than just the wreckage that made him freeze. It was the location, the specific arrangement of rocks and terrain that triggered a flood of memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. 5 years ago, he'd been flying a similar training mission over this same stretch of desert. His wingman that day had been Captain David Chen, a skilled pilot and one of Marcus's closest friends. They'd been practicing low-level navigation when David's aircraft had suffered a catastrophic engine failure. Marcus had watched helplessly as his friend's F-16 had plummeted toward the desert floor, the ejection seat failing to activate, the aircraft disappearing behind a ridge in a ball of fire and smoke. The search and rescue teams had found the wreckage 3 days later, but by then it was too late. David was gone, another name added to the long list of pilots who had paid the ultimate price in service to their country. Marcus had attended the funeral, had comforted David's widow and children, had filed the required reports and answered the investigators' questions. But he'd never returned to this particular stretch of desert, had never wanted to see the place where his friend had died. Now, as he circled above the crash site, Marcus felt his chest tightening with emotion. The F-15 they'd been chasing had disappeared, forgotten in the wake of his discovery. Jake was calling his name over the radio, asking for instructions, but Marcus couldn't respond. All he could do was stare at the wreckage below and remember the man who had died there, alone and far from home. The twisted metal caught the sunlight again, and Marcus realized that what he was seeing wasn't just the remains of David's aircraft. There was something else there, something that hadn't been there 5 years ago when the recovery teams had removed everything they could find. It looked like some kind of electronic device, still intact despite years of exposure to the desert environment. As he flew closer, Marcus could see that the device was mounted on a tall metal pole that had been driven into the ground near the crash site. It was clearly man-made, possibly some kind of radio beacon or navigation aid. But who had put it there, and why? The crash site was in the middle of nowhere, miles from any roads or settlements. The only people who would have had reason to visit this place were the accident investigators, and they'd completed their work years ago. Jake's voice crackled through his headset again, more urgent this time. "Red Leader, what's your status? You've broken off the engagement and you're not responding to my calls." Marcus forced himself to focus on the present situation, keying his radio to respond. "Red 2, this is Red Leader. I need a moment to investigate something. Continue the exercise without me for now." There was a pause before Jake responded, his voice tinged with concern. "Roger that, Red Leader. Are you experiencing any mechanical issues? Do you need me to escort you back to base?" Marcus appreciated his wingman's concern, but he needed to understand what he was seeing before he could make any decisions about returning to base. Negative, Red 2. Aircraft is functioning normally. I just need to take a closer look at something on the ground. Maintain radio contact and be ready to provide assistance if needed. Marcus banked his aircraft into a gentle orbit around the crash site, losing altitude gradually so he could get a better view of the mysterious beacon. As he descended, more details became visible. The beacon appeared to be solar-powered, with a small panel mounted on top of the metal pole. There were what looked like LED lights arranged in a pattern around the device, though from this distance he couldn't tell if they were currently illuminated. Most intriguingly, there seemed to be some kind of plaque or sign mounted at the base of the pole, though he couldn't read the text from his current altitude. Marcus made a decision that went against all his training and experience. He was going to land his aircraft and investigate the beacon on foot. It was a dangerous choice. The desert floor was rough and unpredictable, and landing an F-16 in such terrain carried enormous risks. But something about the beacon compelled him to take a closer look. He needed to understand what it was and why it was there. He circled the area one more time, looking for a suitable landing spot. There was a relatively flat stretch of hardpan desert about a quarter-mile from the crash site that looked like it might support the weight of his aircraft. It would be a challenging landing, but Marcus had made emergency landings before, and his F-16 was designed to handle rough terrain if necessary. Red 2, this is Red Leader. I'm going to attempt a landing to investigate an anomaly on the ground. I need you to climb to 15,000 feet and maintain overwatch. If anything goes wrong, you're to immediately contact base and request search and rescue. Jake's response was immediate and alarmed. Red Leader, that's not advisable. The terrain down there is extremely hazardous, and we don't have authorization for an off-site landing. Marcus understood his wingman's concerns, but his mind was made up. I copy your concerns, Red 2, but I need to do this. The anomaly I'm investigating may be related to a previous aircraft accident, and I need to determine if it poses any threat to flight safety in this area. It wasn't entirely true, but it was a plausible enough explanation to justify his actions if questioned later. He lined up his approach to the makeshift landing strip, lowering his landing gear and configuring his aircraft for touchdown. The desert floor rushed up to meet him, and Marcus held his breath as his main wheels made contact with the hard-packed earth. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled into a rough but controlled roll across the uneven surface. As his F-16 came to a stop, Marcus went through the shutdown procedures, his hands moving automatically over the familiar controls. The engine wound down with a high-pitched whine that gradually faded to silence, leaving only the ticking of cooling metal and the whisper of wind across the desert. He popped the canopy and was immediately struck by the intense heat and the profound silence of the wilderness. Climbing down from his aircraft, Marcus felt his boots crunch on the gravelly surface of the desert floor. The beacon was about a quarter-mile away, clearly visible now that he was at ground level. It was taller than he'd thought, maybe 15 feet in height, with the solar panel and LED array clearly visible at the top. The metal pole appeared to be made of stainless steel or aluminum, designed to withstand the harsh desert environment. As he walked toward the beacon, Marcus passed close to the wreckage of David's aircraft. 5 years of exposure to the elements had taken their toll on the metal, which was now bleached and corroded by the desert sun and occasional flash floods. But the basic structure was still recognizable, a twisted monument to the dangers that military pilots faced every time they took to the skis. The beacon stood about 50 yards from the main wreckage, positioned so that it would be visible from the air to anyone flying over the crash site. As Marcus approached, he could see that his initial assessment had been correct. The device was indeed solar-powered, with a small but sophisticated array of electronics housed in a weatherproof case beneath the LED array. The plaque at the base of the pole was made of brass, green with age but still clearly readable. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he read the words engraved on the metal surface. In memory of Captain David Chen, United States Air Force, a skilled pilot, devoted friend, and loving father. May his sacrifice never be forgotten. This beacon will guide others home. Below the inscription was a date, not the date of David's death, but a date from just 6 months ago. Someone had erected this memorial recently, long after the official investigation had been completed and the crash site had been officially closed. But who? And why now, after all these years? Marcus knelt beside the beacon and noticed a small electronic control panel mounted just below the plaque. The panel had a simple LCD display and a few buttons, suggesting that the device was more than just a passive memorial. It appeared to be some kind of active navigation beacon, designed to broadcast a signal that could be received by aircraft flying in the area. As he studied the device more closely, Marcus heard the familiar sound of jet engines approaching from the distance. He looked up to see Jake's F-16 making a low pass over the crash site, his wingman undoubtedly worried about his extended absence. Marcus waved to indicate that he was okay, but he wasn't ready to leave just yet. He needed to understand more about this beacon and who had placed it here. The control panel on the beacon showed that it was currently inactive, but there was clearly a way to turn it on. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then pressed what appeared to be the power button. The device came to life with a soft hum, and the LED array at the top began flashing in a distinctive pattern. The LCD screen displayed a message, "Memorial Beacon Active," broadcasting on 121.5 MHz. Range, 50 nautical miles. 121.5 megahertz was the international emergency frequency, monitored by all aircraft and air traffic control facilities. This beacon was designed to be heard by any pilot flying within 50 miles of the crash site, a constant reminder of the dangers they faced and the sacrifices made by those who had gone before them. It was both a memorial and a warning, a way to ensure that David's death would not be forgotten. Marcus stood up and looked around the crash site with new eyes. Someone had cared enough about David to create this memorial, to install this beacon and maintain it over the months since its installation. But who? David's family lived back east, and as far as Marcus knew, none of them had ever visited the crash site. His squadron mates had all moved on to other assignments, scattered across the globe by the demands of military life. Jake's voice crackled through his portable radio. "Red Leader, I'm showing an emergency beacon activation from your position. Is everything okay down there?" Marcus keyed his radio to respond. "Red 2, I'm fine. I activated the beacon myself. It's a memorial device, not a distress signal. Continue to maintain overwatch while I finish my investigation." As Marcus studied the beacon more closely, he noticed something else that made his pulse quicken. There were fresh footprints in the sand around the base of the device, along with tire tracks that led away from the crash site toward what appeared to be an old mining road. Someone had been here recently, probably within the last few days. The beacon wasn't just a forgotten memorial. It was being actively maintained by someone who cared enough to visit this remote location on a regular basis. The tire tracks were from a large vehicle, possibly a pickup truck or SUV, and they were deep enough to suggest that whoever had been here had been carrying heavy equipment. There were also signs that someone had been digging near the beacon, though Marcus couldn't tell what they might have been looking for or installing. Marcus followed the tire tracks for about 100 yards until they disappeared onto the harder surface of the old mining road. Whoever had been here knew the area well and had taken care to minimize their impact on the environment. They'd also chosen their timing carefully, visiting when they were unlikely to be observed by military aircraft or other desert travelers. As he walked back toward the beacon, Marcus noticed something else that he'd missed on his initial inspection. There was a small solar-powered camera mounted on the back of the device, aimed toward the crash site. The camera was well camouflaged and professionally installed, suggesting that whoever had placed it there had both the technical knowledge and the resources to create a sophisticated surveillance system. The implications of this discovery were troubling. Someone was monitoring the crash site, recording everyone who visited and possibly transmitting the footage to a remote location. But why? What possible interest could anyone have in a 5-year-old crash site that had been thoroughly investigated and officially closed? Marcus's military training kicked in, and he began to consider the possibilities. Could this be some kind of intelligence operation? Was someone using David's crash site as a cover for other activities? Or was there something about David's death that Marcus didn't know? Something that would explain why someone was maintaining such close surveillance of the area. He thought back to the days following David's crash, trying to remember any details that might be relevant. The official investigation had concluded that mechanical failure was the cause of the accident, specifically a catastrophic engine failure that had resulted in loss of control. David had been flying a routine training mission, nothing classified or sensitive. There had been no indication of enemy action or sabotage. But now Marcus found himself wondering if there was more to the story. David had been a skilled pilot with an excellent maintenance record. His aircraft had been recently serviced and showed no signs of mechanical problems during the pre-flight inspection. The engine failure had been sudden and complete, with no warning signs or indications of trouble. Marcus activated his portable radio and called his wingman. "Red 2, this is Red Leader. I need you to contact base and request that they pull the accident investigation file for Captain David Chen's crash 5 years ago. I want to review all the technical data and witness statements." Jake's response was immediate. "Red Leader, is there something specific you're looking for? Has your investigation turned up new evidence?" Marcus looked around the crash site one more time, taking in the beacon, the surveillance camera, and the signs of recent activity. "I'm not sure yet, Red 2, but I think there may be more to this crash than we originally thought. I need to get back to base and do some research before I can say anything definitive." He walked back to his aircraft, his mind racing with questions and possibilities. The beacon continued to broadcast its signal, a steady electronic pulse that would be heard by every pilot flying within 50 miles of the crash site. As he climbed back into his F-16 and began the startup procedures, Marcus realized that his simple training mission had become something much more complex and potentially dangerous. The takeoff from the makeshift desert landing strip was even more challenging than the landing had been. Marcus had to use full afterburner to get his heavily loaded aircraft off the rough surface, and for a moment it seemed like the F-16 might not have enough power to clear the low hills surrounding the crash site. But years of training and experience paid off, and soon he was climbing back toward his assigned altitude. Jake's aircraft fell into formation beside him as they turned toward home. "Red Leader, what did you find down there? You were on the ground for over an hour and base is asking questions." Marcus considered how much to reveal over the radio. Military communications were monitored and recorded, and he wasn't sure who might be listening. "I found a memorial beacon that someone installed at the crash site," Marcus said carefully. "It's broadcasting on the emergency frequency, and it appears to be actively maintained. I think we need to report this to base security and have them investigate who placed it there and why. The flight back to Elmwood Air Force Base passed in tense silence. Marcus's mind was consumed with thoughts of David's crash and the mysterious beacon. Who had cared enough about his friend to create such an elaborate memorial? And why had they chosen to install surveillance equipment at the crash site? The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that there was something about David's death that he didn't understand. As they approached the base, Marcus could see the familiar runway and control tower rising from the desert floor. It was a welcome sight after the strange discoveries of the day, but he knew that his real work was just beginning. He needed to find out who had erected the beacon and why, and he needed to understand if there was any connection to David's original accident. The landing at Elmwood was routine, a stark contrast to the dramatic takeoff from the desert floor. As Marcus taxied his aircraft back to the flight line, he could see the ground crew waiting to service his F-16. Everything appeared normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled onto something significant, something that could change everything he thought he knew about his friend's death. After shutting down his aircraft and completing the post-flight inspection, Marcus walked into the squadron briefing room where his commander, Colonel Patricia Williams, was waiting for him. She was a tough, experienced pilot who had worked her way up through the ranks, and Marcus had always respected her judgment and leadership. "Captain Rodriguez," she said, her tone serious but not accusatory. "I understand you made an unauthorized landing during your training mission today. Can you explain what happened and why you felt it was necessary to deviate from your assigned mission profile?" Marcus had expected this conversation, and he'd spent the flight back to base preparing his response. "Colonel, I discovered what appeared to be an active electronic beacon at the site of Captain Chen's crash 5 years ago. Given the potential flight safety implications, I felt it was necessary to investigate immediately rather than wait for a formal reconnaissance mission." Colonel Williams studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "And what did you find during your investigation, Captain?" Marcus described the beacon in detail, explaining its apparent purpose as a memorial device and its capability to broadcast on the emergency frequency. He also mentioned the surveillance camera and the signs of recent maintenance activity. "I believe this warrants a full security investigation," Marcus concluded. "Someone has been accessing a restricted crash site and installing unauthorized equipment. We need to determine who is responsible and what their intentions are." The colonel nodded slowly. "I agree, Captain. I'm going to contact base security and have them coordinate with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. This situation needs to be thoroughly investigated." She paused, then added, "I'm also going to need you to provide a written report of everything you observed today, including your reasons for making the emergency landing. Marcus left the briefing room with mixed feelings. He was relieved that his commander was taking the situation seriously, but he was also concerned about the implications of what he'd discovered. If someone was monitoring the crash site, they now knew that he'd been there and had activated the beacon. He might have inadvertently put himself in danger by investigating the device. That evening, Marcus sat in his quarters writing his official report and trying to make sense of the day's events. He'd known David Chen for 3 years before the crash, and they'd flown together on dozens of missions. David had been a careful, methodical pilot who never took unnecessary risks. The idea that he'd suffered a random mechanical failure had always bothered Marcus, but he'd accepted the official explanation because he'd had no reason to doubt it. Now, however, he found himself questioning everything. The beacon, the surveillance camera, and the signs of ongoing maintenance activity suggested that someone else shared his doubts about the official story. But who? And what did they know that Marcus didn't? He pulled out his laptop and began searching through old mission reports and maintenance records, looking for anything that might provide a clue about David's final flight. The official accident investigation had been thorough, but Marcus wondered if there were details that had been overlooked or deliberately concealed. As he worked through the night, Marcus began to piece together a disturbing picture. In the weeks leading up to his death, David had been asking questions about certain classified programs and had been meeting with people outside his normal circle of contacts. He'd also been making copies of technical documents and storing them in a secure location that hadn't been discovered until after his death. The more Marcus researched, the more convinced he became that David's death hadn't been an accident. Someone had killed his friend, and they'd done it in a way that looked like mechanical failure. The beacon at the crash site wasn't just a memorial, it was a signal, a way for someone to communicate with others who knew the truth about what had happened. Marcus realized that he was in danger. By discovering the beacon and activating it, he'd revealed himself to whoever was monitoring the crash site. They now knew that he was asking questions and investigating David's death. He needed to be careful, but he also needed to find out the truth about what had happened to his friend. Over the next few days, Marcus continued his investigation while trying to maintain his normal routine. He flew his assigned missions, attended briefings, and socialized with his squadron mates, but all the while he was gathering information and trying to understand the conspiracy that had cost David his life. The breakthrough came when he found a hidden message in one of David's old mission reports. It was subtle, encoded in the technical language of the document, but Marcus recognized it as a warning about a weapons testing program that was being conducted in violation of international treaties. David had discovered something that powerful people wanted to keep secret, and they'd killed him to ensure his silence. Marcus knew that he couldn't pursue this investigation alone. He needed help, but he also needed to be careful about who he trusted. The conspiracy involved high-ranking military officials and possibly civilians in the defense industry. Anyone could be compromised, and Marcus couldn't afford to make the same mistake that had cost David his life. He decided to reach out to an old friend from the Air Force Academy, someone he trusted completely, and who had the resources to help him investigate the conspiracy. Captain Lisa Martinez was now working as a JAG officer at the Pentagon, and she had access to classified files and the legal authority to pursue criminal investigations. Marcus called Lisa from a secure phone and arranged to meet her during his next leave. He couldn't risk discussing the details over the phone, but he was able to convey the urgency of the situation. Lisa agreed to help, and they made plans to meet in Washington, D.C., where she could access the files and resources they would need. As Marcus prepared for his trip to Washington, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His quarters had been searched while he was on duty, though nothing had been taken. His phone calls were being monitored, and he'd noticed the same cars following him when he left the base. The conspiracy was aware of his investigation, and they were taking steps to stop him. The flight to Washington was tense, with Marcus constantly looking over his shoulder and checking for surveillance. He'd arranged to meet Lisa at a small cafe near the Pentagon, a public place where they could talk without being overheard. As he walked into the cafe, Marcus spotted his friend immediately. Lisa looked older than when he'd last seen her, but her eyes were as sharp and intelligent as ever. "Marcus," she said, standing to embrace him. "It's good to see you, but I'm worried about why you called. You sounded scared on the phone, and that's not like you." Marcus looked around the cafe, checking for anyone who might be listening, then sat down across from Lisa. "I think I've stumbled onto something big," he said quietly. "Something that got my friend David killed 5 years ago. I need your help to investigate it properly, and I need to know if I can trust you completely." Lisa's expression became serious. "You know you can trust me, Marcus. We've been friends for 15 years and I've never broken a confidence. Tell me what's going on, and I'll do everything I can to help." Marcus spent the next hour explaining everything he'd discovered, from the beacon at the crash site to the hidden messages in David's mission reports. Lisa listened carefully, asking questions and taking notes. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and shook her head. "This is worse than I thought," she said. "If you're right about this weapons testing program, we're talking about violations of multiple international treaties and potentially criminal activity at the highest levels of the military. We need to be very careful about how we proceed." They spent the rest of the afternoon developing a plan. Lisa would use her access to Pentagon files to research the weapons testing program and try to identify the people involved. Marcus would return to his base and continue his normal duties while gathering additional evidence. They would communicate through encrypted channels and meet again in 2 weeks to compare their findings. As Marcus prepared to leave Washington, Lisa grabbed his arm. "Be careful, Marcus. If these people killed David to protect their secret, they won't hesitate to kill you too. Watch your back, and don't trust anyone at your base until we know who's involved in this conspiracy." The flight back to Nevada was even more tense than the trip to Washington had been. Marcus was now certain that he was being followed, and he could see surveillance teams at both airports. The conspiracy had resources and reach that extended far beyond the military, and they were taking his investigation seriously. Back at Elmwood Air Force Base, Marcus resumed his normal duties while quietly continuing his investigation. He was careful to vary his routine and avoid patterns that might make him an easy target. He also began making copies of important documents and storing them in multiple locations, ensuring that his research would survive even if something happened to him. The beacon at David's crash site continued to broadcast its signal, and Marcus monitored the emergency frequency whenever he was flying in the area. He noticed that the signal seemed to change subtly from day to day, as if someone was using it to communicate coded messages. The pattern was too complex for him to decode, but he recorded everything and planned to analyze it later. 2 weeks after his meeting with Lisa, Marcus received a coded message through their encrypted communication channel. She had made significant progress in her investigation and needed to meet with him immediately. The message was urgent, suggesting that she discovered something that couldn't wait for their scheduled meeting. Marcus arranged for emergency leave and flew back to Washington, this time taking even more precautions to avoid surveillance. He'd learned from his previous trip and had developed better techniques for detecting and evading the teams that were watching him. The meeting with Lisa was set for a different location, a secure facility where they could talk without fear of being overheard. When Marcus arrived at the meeting location, he found Lisa waiting for him with a thick folder of documents. Her expression was grim, and Marcus could see the strain of the investigation in her eyes. "I found it," she said without preamble. "The weapons testing program David discovered. It's called Project Nightfall, and it's been operating in violation of international law for over a decade. The program is run by a joint military-civilian committee, and they've been using remote desert locations to test weapons that would be illegal under normal circumstances." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of weapons are we talking about?" Lisa opened the folder and pulled out a series of classified documents. "Biological weapons, chemical weapons, and something called enhanced kinetic devices that appear to be some kind of advanced munition. The program has been responsible for dozens of deaths, including several military personnel who asked too many questions. She handed Marcus a list of names, and he felt his blood run cold when he saw David's name on it. These are all the people who died under suspicious circumstances after investigating or questioning Project Nightfall. David wasn't the first, and he won't be the last unless we stop this. Marcus studied the documents, his anger growing with each page. The evidence was overwhelming. Project Nightfall was a rogue operation that had been conducting illegal weapons tests for years, while eliminating anyone who threatened to expose them. The program had resources and connections that reached into the highest levels of government, which explained how they'd been able to operate with impunity for so long. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked. "We can't exactly walk into the Pentagon and demand they shut down.